я запрошую до слова ще одного ветерана нашої конференції, колегу з Польщі, доктора Войцеха Рафаловського, який виголосить свою доповідь, яку він підготував у співавторстві з своєю колегою Наталією Letki, і тема «The use of valence in parliamentary campaigns».
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you very much for having me again. First of all, a small apology because when I saw the topic of the conference, I was willing to have a different presentation about radical rights movements and parties. Although my own research on the topic failed, so I had to come up with a different topic, which is to a lesser degree connected with populism, although it is, because as you will see, the use of valence is especially, it works well with populism, so we will go to that at the end of the presentation. So let's begin. First of all, the work it's a joint work with Natalia Letki, how to say that. She invited me to work with her in the project, and I kind of we joined the international project, which I would say to talk about later on, and that's where the data comes from, but I will talk about that in a minute. First of all, let's define the concept of valence, because what is a parliament and what is a campaign we all know, but valence is not a very clear concept. And it is derived from pretty much, it's present in the political science for quite some time. It was introduced by Donald Stokes, who defined valence as a certain separate dimension of politics. And this dimension of politics and of parties is connected with not what the parties are actually saying or promising to do, like their programs, positions, but what they are differentiated by what is associated with them in the public mind. So it's not about what they say, but what they are seen as to be. And also, the important thing is that valence is connected with what everybody values. So it's something positive. To make it more clear, because how I said that and what it's written in the presentation is not very clear. For example, if we have an issue of fighting corruption, everybody agrees that we should fight corruption. Everybody agrees that politicians should be competent, that he should be honest, that the party should be united, and so on and so forth. But when it comes to positional issues, which are like the opposing thing, the contradictory thing to valence issues, with positional issues, they could be actual controversy. For example, you can advocate for welfare state or against welfare state. You can advocate to integrate with the European Union or against integration with the European Union. Both of these arguments can be made and can be rationally justified. But when it comes to valence, there is only one positive side of an axis. So the politician should be competent, the corruption should be fought, and so on and so forth. Also, valence is important because every politician claims that he's competent, that he's honest, that he will fight corruption, and so on and so forth. But it's the most important thing is not what they say, but how they are seen by the public. So this is the difference between positional competition and valence competition, to make it clear. What is valence in the research that I will be presenting? First of all, Stokes, in his original works, didn't distinguish with two parts or two groups of issues, of phenomena that can be connected with the concept of valence. First of all, some policies can be treated as valence policies because everybody agrees that this policy should be introduced, like for example, fighting corruption. But a different thing are the general characteristics of a candidate or a party connected with the competence, integrity, honesty, unity, and so on. So in our research, we distinguish these two, and we limit the concept of valence in our research only to these pure images of party virtues and vices, namely its competence, integrity, unity, and well, included in integrity, its honesty. So this is what we define as valence in our research. Everything else is it's connected with programmatic dimensions. So our distinction is between valence and policy, which is I hope you can sense the difference in the research. Why we do that? Because we want to show that the elements of party images that we use, like we put under the concept of valence, they are connected with the ability to produce a high quality government, which is one of the important things connected with winning an election, because every party wants to win the election in order by showing that they are capable of good government. So let's move on. As we have the main concept of our research, let's move on to the research questions. So there are two, like first more general. What makes parties turn to either valence dimension or policy dimension during an electoral campaign? What are the incentives and what really works? And the more precise question is how the prevalence of valence and policy references works on the dynamics of campaign. Meaning, like, for example, is there more valence at the beginning of the campaign or at the end, and so on and so forth. So this is the main question, and this is the part of the more general issue which is stated in the first question. So let's move to the theoretical assumption of the hypothesis. And the basis for the argument about the valence dynamics that I will be demonstrating is that elections are stressful events both for parties, both for politicians and voters. But the voter argument, it's most important. And the evidence for this assumption is that actually there has been found that voters on the election day have elevated levels of cortisol, which is a stress hormone. So you can scientifically measure stress, and it has been demonstrated in research. So this is the justification for this assumption. If we had people who are in stress, that are emotionally excited, we know from the psychological research, we know that the stress and emotions in general, they change how people make their decision. For example, stress affects memory consolidation, it impairs memory, it leads to risk-seeking behavior, it also elevates one's propensity to emotional arguments. So it changes how people make decisions, which is an important thing when it comes to political campaigning and gaining votes. And another important assumption is that vices and virtues connected with politicians are also connected with emotions. So the valence dimension has something to do with emotions. I will elaborate that in a moment. The consequences of these assumptions are pretty profound, and by this I mean that appealing to emotions should be partly profitable at the end of the campaign, where people are already excited by the campaign dynamics, they have this elevated level of cortisol, they are more emotional about what's happening. Therefore, we should use more emotional arguments in the campaign. So yeah, this means that we should change our strategies, adjust the strategy to move to more emotional arguments. And since emotions lead to simpler cognitive processing, this means that we should use easy arguments which are easier to understand. What is easier to understand? Policy, which can involve, arguing on both sides of the case, nuancing whether maybe we should give more support to families, or maybe more support to the unemployed, or maybe we should have a different policy on inflation. This is all very complicated. But if we say we are competent and we are very honest, this is simple. This is a simple argument. So I believe that when the emotions are elevated, these kind of arguments are more effective in a political campaign. And emotions also lead to greater reliance on heuristics, which heuristics are also simply, by definition, there are simple ways of thinking on certain topics. Thus, this leads to the main hypothesis of the research. The end of campaign requires parties to use simpler argument and more accessible arguments, which has this only one positive end instead of being very nuanced. So, as the valence references, as I was arguing, are easier for cognitive persistence, therefore they should be used at the end of the campaign when the emotional tension is the highest. This is the main hypothesis, which is again stated as hypothesis 1. Of this research, there are also a few other hypotheses which I'll briefly introduce. The second hypothesis is connected with that during a campaign, parties and politicians are talking about themselves, and they are talking about other politicians and parties. In both cases, they can say something about our own policies and our own valence characteristics, and we can say something about our opponents' policies and valence characteristics. So both topics can be used in regard to self and in regard to other. And because, what are the strategic incentives here? I believe that and I'm basing this on the issue ownership theory by several authors like Rieker or Petrocic, they have shown that there is absolutely no point for a rational campaigner to discuss other parties' policies. Why? Because showing other parties' policies may make our voters realize that the other policy propositions are better than the ones argued by Hussein. So it may they are likely to lead voters from us to other parties. So there's absolutely no reason to talk and say anything about others' policy propositions unless it's kind of inevitable in the course of campaign, like we're forced to do it. But we don't want to do it. So the hypothesis is that when it comes to speaking to they should be about others, there should be mostly valence references, and when it comes to self, there should be both of them, but definitely more policy references, at least in comparison to talk about others. But the main thing about my paper is to concentrate on the dynamics. So I was trying to whether there's a dynamic of valence counter policy in regard to parties, what parties are saying about themselves and what are they saying about the others. So when it comes about the others, the incentive doesn't change. So if we should not talk about others' policies at all. So I believe that there should be no dynamic on about what parties are saying about others, but there should be the dynamics postulated in hypothesis 1 in regard to what parties are saying about themselves. Therefore, there's hypothesis 3 that basing on H1 and H2, I believe the dynamics described in H1, it exists only when it comes to self-references. Again, a third distinction is connected with incumbent and the opposition campaigning, in which the expectation is that incumbents, because they have a record of governing in the previous tenure, they should reference the valence more because they have ways to show that we were competent or we were honest and so on. And when it comes to the opposition, they should say more about policy because they want to propose an alternative. And if the governing party would be proposing new policies, everybody could ask, like, okay, but why didn't you do that already? Because you were in office for like 4 years. So that's how I justify that there should be more balance when it comes to the incumbent and less balance when it comes to the opposition. And the dynamic hypothesis, it's not very clear. And I agree, because in case of the incumbent, if there's more balance, there might be no place for the dynamics. So there may be kind of ceiling effect, which I expect in H5A, but I have also H5 hypothesis 5B, which doesn't expect any difference between the dynamics between the opposition and the incumbent. Let's move on to the data that was used. Thanks to Natalia Letki, I was participating with her in a project led by a team of 3 scholars, Mark Debus, Zineb Sommer-Topku, and Margit Tavic. And they were conducted in research funded by the German National Science Foundation, which is based in Mannheim. And we and 10 other national teams were collecting data on what national daily newspapers, which the titles are given here. I only give the titles for the 9 countries which I used. There was also Portugal in the research, but I didn't use Spain was also in the research, and I didn't use data from Spain. So we coded the content of newspaper articles from the last 30 days of 2 electoral campaigns, 3 in case of the United Kingdom, and we coded what parties are saying in terms of policy and valence through these papers. So what is described as party positions and any kind of stances in this research, in this papers. And this data was quantified by the German team. I can provide you with a link to a paper when the data is precisely described, because it has quite a complex structure. What we have taken from this data is for each day of the campaign and for each party, so it's like a day party cluster, we calculated the percentage of all valence-related content in relation to the sum of all valence and policy-related content on each day for each party in regard to self-references, other references separately. So this is the data set. So the unit of analysis is the party on a day with distinction of self to other, and everything is clustered, and the days are clustered in parties and in campaign and in countries. So this is the data structure of this. Because of the complex data structure, we did robustness testing using ordinarily square regression, fractional logic, Tobit, and multi-level regression, but they all lead to the same results. So I'm showing just simple ordinarily square regression for simplicity. Okay, and these are the results. We have on the dependent variable is the percentage of valence references, and here are the independent variables. I believe these are the ones that we have hypotheses for. There are controls of the division between post-communist and Western European countries, the effective number of parties, the polarization of the party system on the economic dimension, taken from Margit Tavic and Natalia Letki publication. Which I also calculated, and the GDP per capita. We also tested for GDP growth, but it didn't make any difference. So it's GDP per capita. So what about the hypothesis? Hypothesis 1 is confirmed because we have a statistically significant coefficient for the number of days until the election. This is negative, which means that the smaller the distance to the election, the higher number of valence references. So we see that the expected dynamics is confirmed. When it comes to the self-other dimension, there's also negative statistically significant coefficient. The level of 0.01 statistical level, the 3 stars. I forgot to put the information here. So number 1 means self, so it means that there's a lower number of valence references when it comes to self, which also confirms the second hypothesis. When it comes to the dynamics of valence versus policy in distinction to self and other, we see that there's a difference because the interaction effect is significant, and we see that in here that there is no dynamics when it comes to other, because it's for 0. This is the coefficient for other, which means that there is no dynamics for other. So it doesn't change, it confirms the hypothesis free, and which is not shown in the table, but I didn't provide a separate table for that. I can show you that this coefficient is significant for self, which confirms the hypothesis free. When it comes to the incumbent hypothesis, it's not confirmed because we can see that there is no statistically significant difference in the percentage of balance references when it comes to the distinction between incumbent and opposition. Also, there is no difference between the interaction effect of incumbent times number of days. It's also not significant, so the hypothesis H5A has to be declined. There is actually a significant coefficient for the opposition in the model 3, but since the interaction effect is not significant, so we have to reject the hypothesis H5A and confirm the H5B, which is the concurrent hypothesis. So to summarize the results, this shows that the main hypothesis, the main claim, which I justified lengthy with the emotion argument and so on, it's confirmed because as the election draws closer, parties refer or turn to valence-related argument more often. When it comes to this self-other dimension, it is also clear that when it comes to self, parties present themselves both in terms of balance and policy, and when they talk about others, there are much more balance references. And the dynamics, which was shown as a general tendency, it's actually a dynamics of what parties are saying about themselves. So there are these 2 important results which are connected with the dynamics. The incumbency hypothesis do not sustain. And what is maybe we can make it in a discussion. We can think about how is this connected with populism. Maybe it's connected with this. It shows that the emotional argument. It shows the role of emotion in election. Like it's measurable and it has consequences for party strategies. Well, it should have consequences, and there are consequences, or at least we can see that even if parties don't know about the mechanism, and they probably, for sure, they don't know about the cortisol levels, but they probably expect such an effect, so they adjust their strategies to win votes in a more efficient way, and this is what it's confirming here. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. And now questions, Chris. Just use the mic.
Okay. Sorry, I really got a sort of comment and a question. I could not but help look when you had the slide on the newspapers. A particular attention was, I was focused on the UK, because obviously I come from the UK. The concern I've got with those 2 papers is, frankly, if I was doing this exercise, I wouldn't be using those papers. They're very, very small, select circulation. If I was looking at 2 typical papers, you'd be looking at something like the Sun or the Mirror, and possibly the Daily Mail. In which case, I suppose the question I've got is, how much of the results is actually driven by your selection of newspapers, which may not be representative of the electorate that's voting, which I would totally argue those two don't. The other thing is, how do you basically correct for what I think is the concern with those two papers, whereby their content may well be very much driven by editorial stroke proprietor interests, rather than perhaps just reporting what is out there in terms of news. That would be my concern. I don't know whether my Polish colleagues might also query the Gazeta Wyborcza. Let me just explain why. Yes, Gazeta Wyborcza is a very, very strong selling paper, but you will know, both of you, all three of you, that how many people read the press in Poland? I think Poland's press readership is like one of the lowest in the country, in Europe. So I suppose my concern is, is really, particularly on those two instances, are you really capturing that effect properly with just the selection of the press? Or how sensitive are your results to those particular choices?
Yes, thank you. This is actually a fascinating issue, and because I was participating as a research assistant of the Polish coordinator, who was Natalia Letki, and we were in charge of choosing Gazeta Wyborcza and Rzeczpospolita. So these were my choice and Natalia's to do it. But when it comes to the general idea of choosing the newspapers, because actually UK was the first country to be the testing of the mechanism of coding was done on the UK 2005. So the concern was that they wanted to include the old style newspapers, which are the more sophisticated one, like the Sun or I lost the word. They didn't want to have the tabloid type of papers. So that's why the Sun or, I don't know, Daily Mirror or whatever, they were not included in that. That's true that they are the most, they sell well, but they don't include, well, that was the idea of the guy. I would probably need to ask Zineb Sommer-Topko, because she was the project leader to just make this justification. Once again, I remember she talked about it, but it was 2 years ago, so I didn't get it.
Sorry, just to take up on that, I would dispute that, because I'm clear, just also looking at the UK, I remember the Sun particularly saying after one election it was the Sun what won it. They were particularly, the Sun was particularly very strong at not just promoting the sort of Thatcher line or the government in place, but they actually were going after the opposition and actually pointing the searchlight on their policies rather than perhaps what's being argued here. But yeah, I seriously, I find it difficult to not take the tabloids, because essentially that is the more accurate reflection of what people are basing their decisions on. I mean, there are millions of people reading The Sun, not just for, obviously partly for the topless models, though that I think is now being given up, but that's really where people are taking their analysis from, and a lot of that analysis is very, very partisan, and it's very much not looking at the incumbent or say, for example, the Conservative Party record, but very much, going after the opposition. I mean, and a clear example of that is the UK campaign right now, where, basically a lot of the press is highly critical of Corbyn and the policies that he's taking, and almost no real attention being focused on the incumbent May government, to be honest. So I'm sort of, the findings slightly don't marry up with what I've seen over years, which is very much people going after, on a very partisan basis, the other party, with little scrutiny perhaps of their preferred candidate for office, whether it's an incumbent or an opponent.
Yeah, let me say few more words about the choice of newspapers, because the idea was to have the mainstream newspapers, one affiliated clearly with the right-leaning and left-leaning. So in case of Poland, Wyborcza was connected with left-leaning, and Rzeczpospolita was connected with really right-leaning party. This was also connected with the years, because that was before the new right newspapers came out in Poland. Probably today we would make a choice a bit different. Also in Poland, when the political newspapers were included in research, it was always Rzeczpospolita and Wyborcza. So that was probably why we included, like, you know, follow this path that was grounded in some other. I cannot justify for other countries because mostly I don't even know the titles for most of them, so I cannot say that. Also, when it comes to the newspaper scope, or like distinguishing between journalist comments and this kind of area, the coding was there was several rules, like learning this coding scheme included first, I was trained in that, then I had to train 3 students, then the 3 students were coding, they were copying separately, and they were these results were coded, they were tested for congruence and so on. But what was important about this coding? We were coding separately what the party is saying, or like a politician of the party is saying about themselves and about the other. And there was also a separate part of the coding process which included what the journalist says about this politician. So the coder had to distinguish who actually says that. So it was actually, in a great way, it was possible to distinguish what was said by the journalist and what was said by the party itself. And in this research that I'm showing here, I didn't use the journalist results at all. There were 3 data sets, and I only used 2 of them: the other and the self. Yeah, I think these are the most important stuff.
I'm glad you said that, because I was going to act as witness for the defense. In this sort of research, what you've done is entirely typical. You're using the newspaper as a record of events,
yes,
not for the valence of the newspaper, which means you would not want a tabloid newspaper, no matter how popular the tabloid. Your purpose is not to find out what voters are hearing from the newspaper. Your point is to find out how parties are portraying themselves.
Yeah, let me comment shortly on that, because the idea behind this grand project made by the Germans and by Margit Tawitz and Zbigniew Sommer-Topku is that they got tired of using comparative manifesto project. They decided, okay, we did everything we wanted to with that, and we want to have a different source on what the parties are saying. What is the program presented to the voters? That's why they switched to newspapers.
Could you put your hypotheses slide back up? I was just amazed, because before you presented your results, it was very obvious that hypotheses 1, 2, and 3 were the Trump strategy in the 2016 election. And so I'm curious, if you write a textbook, you can use the Trump campaign as the textbook example for hypotheses 1, 2, and 3. And I'm curious about your own thoughts about that.
Actually, I didn't follow Trump's campaign as much to be able to answer that. I didn't follow it that much, and I do research mostly on European politics. So and the United States are not in this research. So,
well, hypothesis 1, "Make America Great Again," is a valence argument. Yeah. Hypothesis 2, Trump never engaged at all with Clinton's policies, but instead he led chants of lock her up, put her in jail, so only referred to her with negative valence. And in number 3, I'm sorry, maybe I have the numbers wrong, sorry. But also Trump's campaign started out with a campaign of policies in the primary elections, but as it came to October and November, it became a campaign of valence. So I was really surprised.
Well, I'm happy to hear that there's other evidence supporting my hypothesis. Actually, I'm not really convinced about myself. I'm not really convinced if I really should put the incumbent hypothesis into the paper, but I will probably have the discussion again in San Francisco on APSA, because this is a paper prepared for APSA. So,
And just keep in mind, the incumbent hypotheses would not really apply in most US elections because the party does not run, the candidate runs.
yeah, well, in this presentation, I meant incumbent party. Yeah, this was the meaning. But when it comes to U.S. election, there's almost always an incumbent candidate in a certain constituency, because there are a lot of re-election happening in the U.S. Yeah, the state level. When it comes to president, it's that. But these are only parliamentary elections, so this is the limitation of this research. It's only European.
Okay, more questions?
How many days before election does the accent changes from balance on yourself to balance from others to balance on yourself? Because you have negative signs for self and positive for the interaction. So at some moment they have to know how to.
But I believe that there is a huge difference between these two. See, there are like two rząd wielkości. I'm lost for word. So I think that this might not actually be reversed, because there are only 30 days. So only this. This after 30 days, it's too small to cancel out, I think.
I simply multiply the interaction by 100, then I will get the positive effect for self.
No, but you cannot multiply these interaction terms by 100. You should not, because there are only marginal effects for two values, 0 and 1. Because this is the interaction. It's only connected with 0 and 1. So there are two marginal effects, which one is given in the table and the second one is somewhere else, but I didn't present it here. So there's only two marginal effect and one interaction terms. There are no 100, because it's a dummy.
You add the interaction term to the coefficients for the effects, and the number of days in model is not statistically significant, it's very small, right?
Yeah.
So actually you have in this interaction you have most of the effect of the time run, right?
But this, I think it doesn't work that way. It's a question of interaction model, but this interaction model? This interaction is the difference between the coefficient estimated for the number of days until the election for self equaling 0, which means other references, and for self equaling 1. So this is the value for self equaling 0. So there is no dynamics when it comes to other references, and this plus this is a coefficient for the self references, which is slightly higher, but it's I'm getting quite lost with the numbers. I'm not sure if I hadn't omit the sign in this. Actually, there might be a typo. There might be a typo because I'm not sure if I have to check once again if there should not be a minus. Yeah, but it's like a copy-paste mistake. Thank you.
Well, this suggests that self-references are falling as the election approaches.
Yes.
Yeah, that's what
There's more valence and less self. Yeah. Yeah. Maybe I've forgotten copying the.
The confusion is because it's number of days before election.
Yes. So.
Counts down.
Yeah, but I actually the first version of this paper was presented in front of the international team of the project. And they told me to reverse these because it was confusing. And now you're saying it's confusing because it's confusing both ways. I assure you. I just need to check once again in order to not omit any sign in there. Yeah.
Thank you.